4 quarterbacks, 1 job, and a head coach who, with training camp just weeks away, still refuses to say who's winning it. If you think that's normal, it's not. Most teams know their starter by June. Cleveland doesn't, and it's not because nobody's good enough. It's because, for the first time in years, the Browns might actually have 2 guys worth fighting over. On one side, a 10th-year veteran sitting on one of the most expensive contracts in NFL history, trying to prove his body can still hold up. On the other, a second-year passer who threw 10 interceptions in 7 starts as a rookie and somehow has his own head coach calling his growth truly phenomenal. Those 2 things should not both be true, and yet here we are. Today we're breaking down exactly why this competition has dragged into July, what each guy actually brings to the table, and why the answer nobody wants to hear might be the most honest one. Nobody outside that building really knows yet. Not the reporters, not the fans, maybe not even Todd Monken. Let's get into it. Start with the number that should stop you cold. 4 quarterbacks are currently in the Browns' quarterback room heading into training camp. Not 2, 4. There's Deshaun Watson, the 10th-year veteran and the presumptive incumbent, at least on paper. There's Shedeur Sanders, the second-year passer who inherited the starting job by accident last season and never fully let it go. There's Dillon Gabriel, a 2025 third-round pick who actually started games last year when injuries opened the door. And there's Talon Green, a rookie added in this year's draft who's more of a long-term project than a camp threat. On the surface, that looks like chaos. 4 arms, 1 starting job, and a front office that hasn't tipped its hand. But strip away the noise, and this is really a 2-man race. Gabriel and Green are auditioning for a roster spot, not the starting job. The real competition, the one actually worth talking about, is between Watson and Sanders. And that's where things get interesting, because these 2 represent almost opposite bets. Watson is the known commodity, at least in theory. A former MVP-caliber talent who signed the largest fully guaranteed contract in NFL history back in 2022, when Cleveland sent 3 first-round picks to Houston to acquire him. Sanders, meanwhile, is the total wildcard. A 5th-round pick a year ago who wasn't even supposed to see the field as a rookie, thrown into action out of necessity, and now somehow neck and neck with a $230 million quarterback for the job. Think about how strange that sentence actually is. A 5th-round rookie competing on even footing with a former first overall pick who signed the richest guaranteed deal in league history. That doesn't happen by accident. Either the veteran has fallen further than people realize, or the rookie has climbed faster than anyone expected. Probably some of both. Here's what makes this specific competition different from the parade of failed quarterback battles Cleveland has run in past years. It's not 2 flawed, unproven options fighting for scraps. It's a former star trying to prove his body still works, against a young player who the building keeps insisting is trending in the right direction. That's not the same tired Browns quarterback story. That's an actual fork in the road. And it's worth remembering how we even got here. Sanders wasn't supposed to be a rookie-year starter at all. When he arrived in camp last year, the coaching staff was so cautious with his reps that he didn't see a single snap with the first-team offense during the competition. He was viewed as a developmental piece, a player the organization liked but wasn't in any hurry to rush onto the field, no matter how much attention surrounded his arrival. Then the roster fell apart around him. The starter got traded. The next man up got hurt. And suddenly, a rookie 5th-round pick, who'd barely practiced with the ones, was thrown into a Week 11 start against a real NFL pass rush with almost no runway to prepare. That's the version of Shedeur Sanders most people watched last season, underprepared, overwhelmed, learning on national television in real time. It's also, if you actually think about it, the least fair evaluation you could possibly run on a young quarterback. And yet here he is, a year later, genuinely competing for the job instead of fighting to make the roster. That alone should tell you something changed. So as we go section by section through this competition, keep that frame in your head. This isn't a battle between a sure thing and a project. It's a genuine question mark on both sides, one defined by health and decline, the other defined by inexperience and growth. Whoever wins is going to win an actual competition, not a coronation. And that's rare enough in the NFL that it deserves the attention it's getting. It's also worth pausing on Gabriel and Green for a moment, because dismissing them as afterthoughts undersells what they add to this picture. Gabriel isn't some anonymous camp arm. He's a player who actually started NFL games last season, stepping in when the depth chart above him got disrupted, and by most accounts, he didn't look overwhelmed doing it. That matters, because it means Cleveland isn't just carrying a raw developmental prospect as its third option. They're carrying a quarterback with a real professional track record, which changes how the front office can think about roster construction if either Watson or Sanders struggles once the games start counting. Green, meanwhile, is closer to a true long-term project, a late-round rookie brought in to develop behind the scenes rather than push for reps this summer. But even a project quarterback affects the math here, because every roster only has so many spots to spend at one position, no matter how open the competition at the top looks. That's part of why this whole situation carries more weight than a typical quarterback battle. It's not just about who starts week 1. It's about how an entire quarterback room gets sorted out, who makes the 53-man roster, who becomes trade bait, and who the organization is quietly building around for the next several years. Those decisions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen based on what unfolds specifically in the next several weeks of padded practice and preseason football. And that brings us back to the central tension worth sitting with as we go deeper into this breakdown. Cleveland has spent years being defined by quarterback uncertainty, but this particular version of uncertainty looks different from the ones that came before it. It's not two unproven names hoping to be adequate. It's a former star with something to prove physically, a fast-rising second-year player with something to prove consistently, and two capable arms behind them adding real depth instead of desperation. However this shakes out, it's going to be decided by what actually happens on the field, not by draft status, not by contract size, and not by preseason hype. That's a rare thing in this league, and it's exactly why this competition has captured so much attention heading into camp. Let's not pretend the numbers were good, because they weren't. If you're going to build a real case for Shedeur Sanders, you have to start by being honest about what actually happened on the field last season, not the hype, not the storyline, the tape, and the stat sheet. Across 7 starts as a rookie, Sanders threw for 1,400 yards on a 56.6% completion rate, with 7 touchdowns against 10 interceptions. The Browns went 3-4 in those starts, which sounds respectable until you remember Cleveland finished the season 4-12 overall, meaning the defense was doing a lot of that heavy lifting in the 2 wins that came down the stretch. That's not a quarterback carrying a team. That's a quarterback riding alongside one. Dig a little deeper, and the picture gets rougher. Sanders faced pressure on 51% of his dropbacks last season, the highest rate in the entire NFL, despite actually being blitzed at one of the lowest rates in the league. In plain terms, teams didn't need to send extra rushers to get after him because his own offensive line simply couldn't hold up on standard 4-man rushes. That's an environment almost no rookie quarterback survives cleanly. And then there's the number that really explains the interceptions. His average time to throw last season was 3.4 seconds, the longest of any quarterback in the league among qualified passers. That's the strongest clue as to what actually went wrong. Sanders wasn't getting rid of the ball. He was holding it, extending plays, waiting for something to open up, sometimes because he didn't trust what he saw, sometimes because there genuinely was nowhere to go. Either way, the longer a quarterback holds the ball behind a shaky line, the more that ball ends up in the wrong hands. This is the part where the analytics crowd usually jumps in with the advanced accuracy numbers. And to be fair, those numbers weren't kind either. Sanders graded out near the bottom of the league in completion percentage over expectation on throws at or beyond the line of scrimmage. That's a real red flag if you're looking at it in isolation. But here's the problem with looking at it in isolation. A rookie 5th-round pick, thrown into a starting role with almost no preparation, throwing behind one of the least protected offensive lines in football, to a receiver room that had no proven difference makers, is about as unfavorable a setup as you can hand a young quarterback. If you want to use one season of advanced rookie year metrics as a permanent verdict on a player's ceiling, You'd have to throw out half the successful quarterbacks currently starting in this league, because plenty of them had brutal rookie tape too. None of that erases the interceptions or excuses the ball security issues. Those are real problems, and they're exactly what Sanders and this coaching staff have spent the offseason trying to fix. But context matters, and the context here is about as difficult as it gets for a young passer. The question heading into year 2 isn't whether the rookie numbers were good. They weren't. It's whether the specific problems that produced those numbers are actually improving. And based on everything coming out of the building this offseason, that's exactly the case Cleveland is trying to make. Let's also talk about how Sanders actually got thrown into this situation in the first place, because it matters for how you should read every number above. He wasn't the plan. He was the emergency option. When camp opened last year, the coaching staff was cautious enough with his reps that he didn't take a single snap with the first-team offense during the early quarterback competition. A sign the organization viewed him as a project for down the road, not a week 1 solution. Then the roster in front of him started to crumble. The presumptive starter got traded away. The next man up in line suffered a concussion. And suddenly, a rookie who'd spent most of camp running with the 3rd and 4th string offense found himself starting against a real NFL pass rush with almost no build-up. That's an almost impossible way to be introduced to professional football. Most rookie quarterbacks who eventually succeed get some version of a soft landing. A stretch of low pressure starts, a strong supporting cast, a coaching staff easing them in. Sanders got none of that. He got live bullets from week 11 onward, against opposing defensive coordinators who'd had a full season to study every other team in the league and zero tape on him specifically. Defenses could disguise pressure looks and coverages without any real fear of him diagnosing it quickly, because there was no prior body of work to prepare against. That's part of why the league-worst time to throw number makes sense. He wasn't just indecisive, he was seeing NFL disguises for the very first time in real games that counted. It's also worth noting what he didn't have around him. The receiver room he was throwing to during that stretch had no player defenses were forced to genuinely account for on every snap, no true field-stretching threat, no reliable possession target defenses had to double. When a rookie quarterback doesn't have anyone forcing a defense to respect the field, opposing coordinators can sell out on protection-heavy pressure packages without fear of getting burned deep. That's exactly the kind of environment that inflates sack numbers, forces off-schedule throws, and produces the interceptions you saw. None of that means Sanders played well. It means the conditions were about as unfavorable as you can construct for a young passer trying to develop good habits in real time. Compare that to how most successful young quarterbacks are brought along elsewhere in the league: a run game to lean on, a line that holds up in obvious passing situations, a security blanket receiver to bail him out on 3rd down. Sanders had almost none of that safety net last season. So when people point to a rough completion percentage over expectation number and treat it as a permanent scouting report, they're often ignoring just how much of that number was shaped by circumstances that have since been directly addressed by the front office. The rookie tape tells you what happened. It doesn't necessarily tell you what happens next, especially when so many of the specific variables that produced it have already been changed. Here's where the story shifts from stat sheets to something a little more interesting: what the people inside the building are actually saying, on the record, with their names attached. Head coach Todd Monken didn't hedge when he was asked directly about Sanders' offseason development. He described growth that started back in January and February, carried through actual practices once May arrived, and called that growth truly phenomenal. Read that again: not solid, not encouraging. Phenomenal. That's not a word a coach throws around casually about a quarterback who threw 10 picks in 7 games the year before, unless something has genuinely changed. And it's not just the head coach. Multiple people around the quarterback room have pointed to 2 specific areas of improvement: footwork and processing. That second one matters more than it sounds. Processing speed, how quickly a quarterback reads a defense, identifies pressure, and gets through his progressions, is exactly the skill that separates a rookie who's overwhelmed from a second-year player who's starting to see the game slow down. It's also, not coincidentally, the exact issue that produced Sanders' league-worst time to throw last season. Sanders himself has talked about the offseason in personal terms, calling it the most important stretch of his life to this point, and describing a period of real self-reflection after a rookie year that, by his own account, taught him things about the NFL that are almost impossible to understand from the outside looking in. That's not spin from a beat reporter. That's a young player publicly admitting the gap between college production and professional readiness caught him off guard, and then describing exactly the kind of offseason you'd want a player to have in response. Monken has also been transparent about why he still hasn't named a starter, and it's worth taking him at his word here rather than assuming there's a hidden agenda. He's pointed to the simple difficulty of fully evaluating either quarterback before pads go on. Spring practices, no matter how good they look, don't include real contact, a live pass rush, or the physical toll of an actual football game. Monken has said directly that he'd love to make the call already, either through someone clearly separating themselves, up or down, but that hasn't happened yet, and he's not willing to fake certainty he doesn't have. That's a notably different tone than we've seen out of Cleveland quarterback competitions in years past, where decisions often felt driven by draft investment, contract size, or organizational pride as much as actual performance. This time, the message from the top has been unusually consistent. Both quarterbacks have played well enough this offseason to have genuinely earned the right to compete for the job, not just occupy a roster spot, while the real answer waits in the wings. Put it together, and you get a picture that's rare for this specific quarterback competition. Public praise for the young player's development, an honest admission from the coaching staff that they don't have the answer yet, and a young quarterback who sounds like he actually understands what went wrong last year instead of making excuses for it. None of that guarantees Sanders wins the job, but it does explain why this competition is still alive at all, instead of being handed to the veteran by default. It helps to compare this to how coaching staffs usually talk about a young quarterback who genuinely hasn't developed. Normally, when a young passer isn't progressing, you get vague, non-committal language from the building, coach speak about competing every day or earning his role, phrases specifically designed to avoid saying anything definitive because there isn't anything definitive to say. That's not what's coming out of Berea right now. Monken didn't reach for a safe cliché when asked about Sanders. He used specific language, footwork, processing, a growth arc that started months before camp even opened. The kind of detail you only get when a coaching staff is actually tracking measurable improvement, not just being diplomatic in front of a microphone. The footwork piece deserves its own attention because it connects directly back to last year's biggest structural problem. A quarterback's footwork dictates his rhythm in the pocket, how quickly he can reset after a bad first read, how cleanly he can climb the pocket instead of drifting backward into pressure, how consistent his base is when he's forced off his intended launch point. Given how often Sanders was operating under pressure last season, cleaner footwork isn't a cosmetic tweak. It's a direct answer to the exact conditions that made his rookie season so difficult in the first place. The processing piece matters even more, because it's the hardest thing to fake and the hardest thing to coach quickly. Processing speed is essentially a quarterback's internal clock, how fast he goes from snap, to read 1, to read 2, to a decision, all while tracking where the pressure is coming from. Rookies almost universally struggle with this, because the game is simply faster than anything they experienced in college, and no amount of film study fully replaces live reps against professional disguises. If multiple people inside the building, not just the head coach, but the position coach directly responsible for that development, are independently pointing to processing as a specific area of growth, that's a meaningfully different signal than generic off-season optimism. There's also something worth noting in how Sanders himself has talked about the offseason. Players who are in denial about their rookie struggles tend to talk in generalities, just getting more comfortable, learning the offense. Sanders instead described a real self-reflection process, acknowledging directly that there were things about playing quarterback in the NFL that are almost impossible to understand until you've actually lived through a season of it. That kind of specific, somewhat uncomfortable honesty from a young player is usually a better predictor of real improvement than public confidence would be, because it suggests he correctly diagnosed his own problems instead of blaming the circumstances around him. Even though, as we covered, plenty of those circumstances really were working against him. None of this is a guarantee. Praise in June and July has a long history of not surviving contact with live football in September. But when you stack specific coaching detail, a credible internal explanation for what actually improved, and a player's own honest account of his offseason on top of each other, you get something more substantial than the usual hype cycle that surrounds every training camp quarterback competition in this league. None of this means Deshaun Watson is out of the picture, far from it. To understand why this competition is as close as it is, you have to take an honest look at what Watson still brings and where the real questions about him actually live. Start with the resume. At his peak, Watson was one of the most dangerous dual-threat quarterbacks in football, the kind of player who could extend plays with his legs and still deliver accurate throws down the field under pressure. That's why Cleveland was willing to send 3 first-round picks to Houston back in 2022 to acquire him, and why they fully guaranteed a contract worth $230 million to make him their long-term answer at the position. That kind of investment doesn't happen for an average talent. Whatever you think of how it's played out since, the ceiling that justified the trade was real. The honest question isn't whether that talent existed. It's how much of it is still available now, several years and multiple significant injuries later. Watson has dealt with serious health setbacks during his time in Cleveland, including multiple procedures on the same leg that have limited the number of full, healthy seasons he's been able to put together since arriving. That's simply part of the picture, and it's a fair thing for a coaching staff to weigh heavily when deciding who gives the team the best chance to be productive across an entire season, not just a strong training camp. There's also a financial reality that shapes this competition, whether anyone wants to say it out loud or not. Watson is heading into a significant point in that guaranteed contract, and that creates real organizational pressure in both directions. On one hand, there's an obvious incentive to justify the investment by naming him the starter. On the other, a front office that's serious about building a winning roster has to be willing to separate what they've already paid from what they're actually seeing on the practice field right now. Those are two different questions, and conflating them is exactly how bad quarterback decisions get made across the league. To Watson's credit, people around the building have spoken positively about both quarterbacks this offseason, not just Sanders. This isn't a situation where the coaching staff is quietly rooting against the veteran. By all accounts, Watson has put in real work too, and Monken has been clear that both players have earned the right to compete rather than simply hold a job by default. But here's the fundamental tension at the center of this competition. Sanders' questions are about experience and consistency, the kind of things that tend to improve naturally as a young player gets more competitive reps. Watson's questions are about health and durability after multiple major injuries, which is a very different kind of uncertainty, one that doesn't necessarily get better with more practice snaps. That distinction matters enormously once the pads come on and live contact becomes part of the evaluation, because it's the one variable training camp can actually start to answer. It's worth being precise about what Watson actually offers when healthy, because it's easy to let the contract and the injury history overshadow the football itself. At his best, Watson was a rare combination of accuracy and mobility. A quarterback who could go through full progressions from a clean pocket like a classic passer, but who could also escape a collapsing pocket and either extend a play or pick up yardage with his legs when nothing was open downfield. That dual threat dimension is exactly what made him worth 3 first-round picks in the first place. It's a very different skill set than what Sanders brings right now, and if even a meaningful percentage of that peak ability is still available, it changes the calculus for what kind of offense Cleveland can run. The complicating factor is simply games played. Watson has appeared in a limited number of games across his time in Cleveland relative to a normal starter's workload, largely because of the injury issues that have interrupted multiple seasons. That's not a knock on his talent, it's a straightforward accounting of how much recent, healthy, competitive football is actually in the sample size the coaching staff has to evaluate. When a team is trying to project how a quarterback performs over a full 16 or 17-game season, a small sample of recent healthy play makes that projection inherently harder, no matter how good the tape looks in the games he has played. There's also a psychological dimension to training camp for a player in Watson's position that shouldn't be ignored. Competing for a job you were previously handed as the unquestioned franchise quarterback is a different mental experience than competing for a job you're trying to win for the first time. Watson has talked, in various forms over the past couple of years, about wanting to prove he can still be the player Cleveland thought they were getting back in 2022. That kind of motivation can cut either way. It can drive an intense, focused offseason, or it can create pressure that's difficult to perform under when every practice rep is being measured against a younger competitor nipping at his heels. On the contract question specifically, it's worth separating two different things people tend to blend together: the money already spent and the decision about who plays quarterback this season. Those are financially connected, but competitively separate. A front office that lets sunk cost dictate an active football decision is making exactly the mistake that experienced team builders try hardest to avoid. To their credit, everything coming out of Cleveland's building this offseason suggests Monken is trying to keep those two questions apart, evaluating both quarterbacks on current performance rather than defaulting to the bigger contract. Whether that holds once the games actually start counting is one of the more interesting subplots to watch as this competition plays out. If there's one thing that explains everything about how this competition has unfolded, it's this: Todd Monken does not trust shorts and helmets practice as a big enough sample size to hand somebody the keys to a franchise. That's not a guess, it's essentially what he said directly. Spring practices and minicamp reps happen in a controlled environment. There's no live pass rush trying to blow up the pocket, no real contact, none of the physical unpredictability that actually defines an NFL football game. A quarterback can look sharp in shorts and still fall apart the moment someone's genuinely trying to knock him down. Monken has been explicit that he wants to see both quarterbacks in padded, physical situations, real practices, and eventually preseason games, before he's willing to make a call either way. That's exactly why this competition has stretched from spring workouts into training camp, and why it's expected to keep going deeper into the preseason before a decision gets made. It's not indecision for its own sake. It's a coaching staff refusing to rush a franchise-defining call based on an incomplete picture. And when you actually think about what each quarterback needs to prove, the extended timeline makes even more sense. For Sanders, every additional week of padded practice is another chance to keep stacking good reps on top of each other, continuing the trajectory his coaches have already praised, but now under conditions that actually resemble a real NFL game. For Watson, every additional week of live contact is another opportunity for the health and durability question to get answered one way or the other, for better or worse. Time isn't a neutral factor here. It's actively going to reveal information that spring practice simply couldn't. There's also a version of this where the extended competition benefits the organization regardless of who wins it. If Sanders keeps climbing in live, physical reps, Cleveland gets confirmation that last year's rookie struggles were more about circumstance than ceiling, which is exactly what they need to build around going forward. If Watson shows he can hold up physically across padded practices and preseason snaps, that answers the single biggest doubt hanging over his half of the roster. Either outcome gives the front office real information to plan around, instead of a decision built on hope. It's also worth noting how much has changed around both quarterbacks this offseason, which is going to make this evaluation more meaningful than it might have been a year ago. Cleveland significantly reshaped its offensive line and receiver room this offseason, adding a mix of veteran free agents and high draft investment specifically aimed at fixing the protection issues that plagued the offense last season. That matters for this competition because it removes some of the excuses. Whoever wins this job is going to have more help up front and more legitimate targets down the field than either quarterback had to work with for most of last season. Which means, for the first time in a while, this competition should actually reflect what these two players can do. not just what a shaky supporting cast allowed them to do. Think about why that upgraded supporting cast makes the padded practice evaluation so much more informative than it would have been otherwise. Last season, when Sanders held the ball too long or made a rushed decision under pressure, it was often genuinely unclear how much of that was on him versus on a line that couldn't sustain a pocket for more than a couple of seconds. This year, if the same hesitation shows up against a live, competitive pass rush in padded practice, there's far less room to explain it away as a product of circumstance. Conversely, if the extra time and better protection produces the kind of quicker, more decisive quarterback play his coaches have already started describing, that's a much stronger signal about actual improvement rather than simply an easier situation. The preseason games matter for a similar reason, maybe even more so. Practice reps, even padded ones, still happen in a somewhat controlled environment. Reps are often scripted to some degree, situations are chosen by the coaching staff, and there's rarely the same chaos of a live opposing game plan specifically built to attack a particular quarterback's tendencies. Preseason games strip away some of that control. An opposing defensive coordinator, even in a preseason setting, is going to dial up disguises and pressure looks specifically designed to see how a quarterback reacts to something he hasn't seen scripted in practice. That's exactly the kind of stress test Monken has said he wants before making his decision, and it's a much closer approximation of what either quarterback will actually face once the regular season begins. There's a broader lesson in how Monken is approaching this timeline that's worth sitting with, especially for anyone frustrated that Cleveland hasn't already named a starter. Plenty of coaching staffs around the league make quarterback decisions off spring practice alone, either because of roster pressure, media pressure, or simple impatience. Those decisions don't always age well, because spring football and real football measure genuinely different things. By deliberately extending this evaluation into padded practice and preseason games, Monken is trading a faster answer for a more reliable one. That's a defensible approach for a franchise that has been burned by rushed quarterback decisions more than almost any other team in the league over the past 2 decades. Even if it means fans and media have to sit with uncertainty a little longer than they'd like. Here's the subplot that tends to get buried under all the starter speculation. Cleveland currently has 4 quarterbacks on its roster, and there simply aren't 4 roster spots worth of long-term plans to go around. Gabriel and Green aren't part of the Watson-Sanders conversation in terms of the starting job, but they're very much part of a bigger question the front office has to answer this summer. Gabriel, in particular, has real NFL experience under his belt. He started games last season when the depth chart above him got hit by trades and injuries, and by most accounts handled himself reasonably well in that stretch. That makes him more than just camp filler. It makes him a legitimate trade chip or valuable depth piece, depending on how the top of the depth chart shakes out. That creates an interesting ripple effect once the Watson-Sanders competition actually resolves. If Watson wins the job outright, there's been chatter around the league about whether Sanders becomes a trade candidate later in the summer. Not because the front office has soured on him, but simply because a team that goes all in on its veteran quarterback for the foreseeable future might look to recoup some value from a talented young backup rather than let him sit on the bench. That's a coldly logical front office calculation, not a referendum on Sanders' talent. It's worth being careful with this part of the story, because a lot of what's circulating here is speculation, not settled fact. Some of it comes from reporters characterizing the mood around the league rather than confirmed reporting out of Cleveland's own building. The more grounded takeaway is simpler. With 4 quarterbacks on the roster and a genuine 2-man race at the top, some kind of subtraction is coming, whether that's during final roster cuts or in a trade. Which quarterback that ends up being is very much still undetermined, and probably won't be clear until the Watson-Sanders competition itself is resolved. What's not speculation is the value of clarity for the rest of the offense. Every position group benefits from knowing who the guy is sooner rather than later. The receivers, the tight ends, the offensive linemen learning protections, even the play-calling staff building a scheme. An extended quarterback competition creates uncertainty that ripples outward, which is exactly why, Even with Monken's insistence on taking his time, there's real pressure building toward getting a clear answer before the regular season actually starts. Let's think through the actual roster mechanics for a second, because carrying 4 quarterbacks deep into the summer is unusual even by NFL standards. Most teams settle on 2, occasionally 3, quarterbacks by the time final roster cuts arrive, simply because every extra spot at one position is a spot that could otherwise go to a specialist, a depth piece on the offensive or defensive line, or extra insurance at a thinner position group. Carrying 4 this deep into camp either means the coaching staff genuinely can't separate the bottom 2 from the competition yet, or it means the front office is deliberately maximizing trade leverage by letting the market see all 4 options perform in live situations before deciding who to move. That second scenario is actually the more interesting one from a team-building perspective. If Gabriel performs well in padded practice and preseason snaps, while clearly playing behind Watson or Sanders on the depth chart, his trade value only goes up the more good tape he puts on film in front of the rest of the league. Teams that need a competent backup or a potential change of scenery starter pay attention to exactly this kind of situation. Cleveland has real incentive to let this play out publicly rather than making a quiet roster decision in June, because a strong summer from a clearly buried quarterback can turn into an actual draft pick or a useful trade return in September. The Sanders side of that same equation carries more emotional weight for fans, understandably, given how much attention followed him into the league. But it's worth being clear-eyed about the mechanics here too. If Watson wins the starting job and looks the part in live action, Sanders becomes an extremely valuable trade chip, specifically because he's a talented young quarterback still on a cost-controlled rookie contract. The exact kind of asset that other rebuilding teams around the league would give up real draft capital to acquire. That's not Cleveland giving up on him. That's Cleveland recognizing that a talented backup quarterback on an affordable deal has more value to another franchise's quarterback competition than he does riding the bench behind an established starter. None of this changes the fact that the competition at the top still has to play out first. But understanding the roster math helps explain why so much league-wide attention is being paid to a competition that, on paper, only affects one job. In reality, it affects 4 careers, at least one likely trade, and possibly the foundation of some other franchise's quarterback room by the time final cuts roll around in late summer. That's a lot riding on padded practices most fans will never actually see in full. Step back for a second, because there's a larger pattern here that Browns fans understand better than fans of almost any other franchise in the league. Cleveland has been chasing quarterback stability for what feels like an entire generation. Different regimes have tried different answers. High draft picks that didn't develop the way anyone hoped. Veteran band-aids brought in for a year or two and then discarded. And of course, the franchise-altering gamble on Watson himself, a move that hasn't come close to delivering what the front office envisioned when they surrendered 3 first-round picks and guaranteed $250 million to make it happen. Every version of this story has followed a familiar arc. Real optimism in the summer, followed by disappointment once the games actually start counting. That history is exactly why some fans are approaching this year's competition with caution rather than excitement. The scar tissue is earned. But it's also worth asking whether this year is genuinely different from those past cycles, rather than just assuming it's the same story wearing a new jersey. A few things actually do set this competition apart. This isn't 2 unproven, flawed options being forced into a job nobody's ready for. It's a former star trying to prove his body can still hold up, against a young player who's shown real, coach-verified growth with a significantly upgraded roster around him. That's a fundamentally different kind of uncertainty than which unproven guy is less bad, which has been the honest framing of more than one Browns quarterback battle in recent memory. There's also the matter of how open this competition has actually been kept. In a league where plenty of coaches quietly signal their preferred starter well before camp even opens, protecting a veteran's ego, or handing a rookie the job for public relations reasons, Monken has done neither. He's kept this thing genuinely undecided, and that alone suggests he's taking the decision as seriously as the stakes actually demand. None of this guarantees a happy ending. Cleveland's history offers plenty of reasons for fans to stay skeptical, and hope alone has never been enough to fix a genuinely broken quarterback situation. But the specific shape of this competition, genuine uncertainty, real investment in the surrounding roster, and a coaching staff willing to let the answer play out in live action rather than force it, is different enough from the franchise's recent past that it deserves to be judged on its own terms, not lumped in with every quarterback competition that came before it. It's worth remembering just how long this search for stability has actually gone on, because the number is genuinely staggering when you say it out loud. Cleveland has cycled through an extraordinary number of different starting quarterbacks over the past 2+ decades. A mix of early draft busts, aging veterans brought in for a season or two, and reclamation projects that never quite reclaimed anything. Very few franchises in modern NFL history have experienced that level of instability at the most important position in the sport, and it's exactly why every quarterback competition in Cleveland gets treated with a mixture of hope and dread by the fan base. The hope is obvious. The dread comes from having watched this same story fail to resolve itself so many times before. What makes evaluating is this time different. So tricky is that every previous era probably felt different in the moment too. Fans and media around each of those failed quarterback eras likely found their own reasons for optimism at the time: a strong training camp, an encouraging preseason, a coach's confident public comments. Hindsight makes those hopes look naive, but they didn't necessarily feel unreasonable in July of whatever year they were made. That's worth holding onto as a note of humility here. It's entirely possible that some of the optimism circulating about this year's competition will look the same way in hindsight, a year or two from now. That said, there are a few concrete, checkable differences this time that don't rely purely on vibes or coach speak. The volume of resources invested in fixing the supporting cast, the offensive line rebuild, the receiver room additions, is a real, measurable commitment, not just a hopeful narrative. The extended, genuinely undecided nature of the competition itself is also unusual. Plenty of past Browns quarterback battles were effectively decided well before camp opened, with the competition more of a formality than a real contest. And the fact that specific, detailed praise is coming from multiple people in the building about Sanders' actual mechanics and processing, not vague encouragement, is a different flavor of optimism than the generic hype that's accompanied plenty of previous Cleveland quarterbacks. Whether those differences are enough to finally break the cycle is exactly what the next several months are going to answer. But they are, at minimum, real and specific enough to justify treating this competition with a bit more seriousness than the usual round of Cleveland quarterback optimism that tends to evaporate somewhere around week 6. So where does that leave things heading into camp? A genuinely split picture. A former star trying to prove his body still works. A young player who keeps climbing every time the coaching staff is asked about him. A rebuilt roster around both of them that's about to remove every excuse either one has had up to this point. Here's the honest truth. Nobody outside that building actually knows how this ends yet, and if anyone tells you otherwise with total confidence, they're guessing just like the rest of us. What we do know is that this is being decided on merit, in real time, under conditions that are finally going to test both quarterbacks the same way an actual NFL season will. Once the pads go on and the preseason games start, all the speculation gets replaced by something much simpler: what actually happens on the field. That's the version of this story worth waiting for. So here's the real question, not who should win this job, but who you think actually does. Drop your pick in the comments before you forget, and let's see how many of us end up right once camp tells the real story.